This objective is Orky now. All of you Space Marines can zog off. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about all things objective related, how they work, tactics for holding them, and some ways to steal them from under your opponent's nose. I think some of the real skill in Warhammer 40k comes between balancing destroying the opponent's army and managing to score maximum points on objectives while doing so, and being decently ahead on primary objectives seems like a good way to win the game. In the video we'll talk about a basic overview of objective scoring, a few basic tactics for securing home objectives and midfield objectives, a few generic sneaky tricks for taking and holding them, and a couple of faction-specific rules to take advantage of. So let's start with the basics of scoring primary objectives then. In 40k, objective markers are typically 40mm in size, and models can secure it if they're within 3 inches horizontally or 5 inches vertically, and to secure it over your opponent you need to have more models than them within that range. Objective secured and equivalent rules are very common throughout 40k, typically appearing on the troops section of any detachments, though plenty of armies have tricks to get it on different units, whether it's Astra Militarum Leman Russes in a spearhead, or Adeptus Custodes who have it army-wide. If you have a model with objective secured on it and your opponent doesn't, then that objective is yours. If you both have an OBSEC unit within 3 inches though, then neither player's OBSEC has any effect whatsoever and you just literally count up the models as before. It doesn't matter if you have more OBSEC models than your opponent, it's just the total amount of models, provided at least one model on each side is OBSEC. Finally, aircraft and fortifications can never control objective markers, so you don't need to take them into account. For primary objective scoring in 40k, they are scored at the end of each player's command phase, which means that on your turn you can't just walk up onto an objective and then it's yours. You basically have to move onto it into your previous turn and survive a turn of your opponent's retribution before you actually get to secure that objective. It means that typically there's a big incentive to put multiple big durable units on each objective to prevent your opponent just killing you straight off them so you don't score said objective. For scoring victory points on primaries, there are 2 types of mission: take and hold and domination. For take and hold you only need to hold 1 for 5 points, 2 for another 5 points, and more than your opponent for another 5. For domination missions, which typically have more objectives, it's 5 points for the first 2 that you hold, and 5 points if you hold 3, and again you get your final 5 for having more than your opponent. You can score these on each turn after your first, so theoretically if you had all the objectives all game long you could score up to 60 points, but the total that you score on primaries is capped out at 45, so you can never score more than this. In most missions in 40k, you'll often have at least one objective in your own deployment zone, and plenty in the midfield. In theory, it should be very easy to keep your home field objective secured. You do get to deploy there after all. Hopefully you can just leave something cheap on it and commit minimal resources to defending and holding it, while the rest of your army goes forward to the midfield to fight and destroy your opponent. Ideally though, you do want to leave enough units on it that your opponent isn't just going to shoot you off it. These could be durable gunline elements, things like tough infantry squads or vehicles, potentially even units in transport vehicles. Screen characters may as well be sitting on it as well, if they are just going to be sitting in the middle of your gunline giving buffs, and sometimes it might be very easy to secure an objective indeed if they happen to be very close to terrain, and you could potentially hide a cheap unit out of line of sight within that piece of terrain. Even if there's no line of sight blockers, having a few infantry models in light cover or something could be pretty handy for the extra durability on that unit. Typically you don't want to be committing massive amounts of resources to your home objective though. Things that are wanting to sit back and shoot are pretty decent options, but failing that, things just like chaff infantry, one of the cheapest troop slots that you have to offer, such as Chaos Cultists perhaps, or a unit with just an excessive amount of durability that your opponent really isn't going to want to bother to shoot down. Things like Space Marine Heavy Intercessors are a good example. In terms of how durable they are for how much damage they do, they're likely to be very low on the target priority list. If your opponent has plenty of deep strike reserves, you could think about trying to screen out the objective as well. Obviously that's going to matter a lot depending on exactly what army you're playing, but often even fairly elite armies could be able to keep reserves away from objectives. As each model creates a big 9-inch bubble around itself that stops reserves, it really doesn't take all that many to zone out your entire deployment zone. So that's the easy stuff. Now let's talk about the midfield objectives, the ones that you really have to fight for. Most of the time, though not always, it does make it easier if you can get there first before your opponent. Things with forward deployment options are pretty ideal for this. Things like Space Marines Infiltrators and Incursors, or Chaos Nurglings are pretty much ideal for this. They can sit straight on the objectives, or potentially just put themselves in a position to move on to them in your turn 1. If they can use line of sight blocking terrain to hide from enemy guns, then so much the better. Anything with a pre-game move is usually a good idea as well. Admech Cerberus Raiders can really help press the enemy back. Raven Guard and Alpha Legion both have stratagems that allow them to, as do Stygies from AdMech, Guard Sentinels, or the entire Necron Custom Dynasty that allows a 6-inch pre-game move, potentially combined with some Auspex Scarab Swarms. Otherwise, you could think about some fast movers to get there turn 1 as well, and bonus points if it has objectives secured too. Horde armies can be very hard to take the midfield from if they get there first, so things like Chaos Demonettes are very nasty. Guard with their move tricks can get an absolute ton of bodies into the midfield if they want to, and Deathwatch have some nice shenanigans that they can do with their kill teams. They can get Obsec Space Marine Outrider bikes, which have the movement and durability that you want when claiming objectives. The other tactic that you can go for is just having a brutal push towards them with some slower, heavier hitting units though. Most objectives tend to be within 12 inches of both players' deployment zone. If you are putting some very durable, heavy hitting melee troops on the line, then they're going to be in a position to charge those objectives, even if your opponent has taken them first. Say if your opponent is moving up with a whole ton of assault intercessors to try and get onto the midfield, if you do put some infiltrating units on the objectives on turn 1, then it might actually mean that you're both just gifting him a free charge, and also potentially even gifting them an objective that they wouldn't have been able to reach if you hadn't put a unit on it, so they got the extra charge distance. Always remember when putting down things like infiltrators and nurglings, you don't necessarily need to start them directly on the objective on your turn 1, you can just put them in movement range on turn 1, because it's actually turn 2 that makes the difference, not turn 1. When both players' armies are starting to commit, it's generally going to be a fight to try and flip the objectives each turn in each player's turn, as well as just destroying the opponent's army outright. The aim is to try and take as many of the objective markers that they hold, and either just destroy the opponent's units on them, or hopefully turn them to your side by putting one of your own units on them. I feel like this is one of the most skillful areas of Warhammer 40k. You're basically trying to expend as little resources possible to have the most effect in terms of flipping objectives over, while also balancing this out against destroying the opponent's army and just dealing damage so you win the game in the long run, and also scoring those all-important secondaries. To actually flip an objective from your opponent over to you, you can think about killing the unit on it and then using speed to get there. Maybe run a unit of fast bikes up to an objective and then use your firepower to gun the enemy unit that's already on it down. You could think about just outnumbering them or out-obsecing them on the objective. If the opponent's only got 3 obsec models on one objective, you might be able to move a guard infantry squad up there, and just take it off them by standing them right next to them, just by sheer weight of bodies. Otherwise, you can think about charging into melee, ideally with a better combat unit of your own, and either kill the enemy unit or tri-point them so they can't fall back without using desperate breakout. But sometimes it might even make sense just to charge in with a unit that you know won't win the fight. This heroic squad of guardsmen might be able to swarm a couple of lone space marines, even if the space marines are going to cut through a whole bunch of them, if they do take the objective for a turn. If you are playing an army with big board control, such as horde demons or orcs for example, by putting loads and loads of bodies in the midfield and potentially daisy chaining them out across the opponent's lines, you might really be able to hamper the opponent's advance from getting anywhere near the objectives. Ground-based opponent's forces aren't going to be able to take the objectives if they're still fighting through enemy units that are in their own lines. Tagging things in melee can be really frustrating as well, as it might prevent them charging the targets that they actually want to charge. There are plenty of tricks that might allow you to take an objective or hold it when your opponent might have otherwise taken it. Firstly, I will think about army composition. A few units with really good speed and durability are really nice to have in the list, even if maybe point for point their damage output isn't great. You can think about the entire big picture of objectives. It might not really matter if your opponent has got one objective super locked down with a whole load of slow forces. If you can fight and win for the other 3, you could completely pull back from that objective, allowing them to take it for a while. It could be good to just focus down one objective and just focus on taking one area of the battlefield away from the opponent by committing your reserves and fast moving units to that flank. When defending objectives, heroic intervention can be a useful tool. If you put a character with a 40mm base directly on an objective, then it means that they'll always be able to heroic intervene into an enemy unit if they do want to just move up and try and take it. It can at least drastically punish them from using the tactic of just moving up an infantry squad and keeping them just outside of melee. Having objectives secured on some unlikely units in your army could be a big plus as well. For example, there's a Space Marine Warlord trait that allows them to make themselves or another unit obsec. That could really surprise some people if you have a captain on a bike zooming across the board with obsec and maybe stealing an objective away from a unit that was otherwise going to take it. Finally, as well as just movement and charging onto units that are directly on objectives, you can often get a lot of movement out of the charge and fight phase, and potentially get your units that are near an objective onto an objective by using the movement that you can get from there. If your unit can't quite make it onto an objective to contest or take it from an opponent, you could think about declaring a charge on a unit that's not on the objective, and then daisy chaining out so your unit just makes it. Every so often your opponent might allow you to use pile-ins and consolidates to get onto objectives as well. I remember one quite fun moment when I was charged by a Talos into a scout squad. The Talos killed almost all of the scouts, but the last remaining one was able to use his pile-in and consolidate move to just get onto an objective which they previously weren't contesting. That could potentially be a really massive swing if your opponent thinks they've managed to take it with their own melee unit. Of course, every faction has their own tricks and options with stealing objectives. We already mentioned that you can get Auspex on some unusual units, such as that Space Marine Captain or Death Watch with their Outriders, or Imperial Knights with certain relics. Any ability that breaks the normal movement rules of the game is usually a good option as well. Guard moving can get Auspex across the board at double time, and other double move powers such as Eldar Quickening, Warp Time from Chaos, particularly when applied to fast-moving or durable units. Resurrection or healing abilities can also be useful, such as Necron reanimation protocols, which again could give your squad just a few further inches of reach. You can think about pulling off charges from reserve, which is a good way to get your troops to the front line, and some factions have some abilities to set up troops very close by indeed, such as Genestealer Cults and Grey Knights, both of whom have stratagems to deep strike units within 3 inches of enemies, and potentially do that with OBSEC units too. Finally, as well as pile-ins and consolidations, any other tricks that you can use in your opponent's charge phase are absolutely excellent, as that's the phase where you're just about to score objectives in the next turn. Some factions have nice counter-charge strats, or stratagems that allow a surprise heroic intervention. Adeptus Custodes' Stooping Dive can be good, Salamanders have a counter-charge stratagem, Blood Angels have Unbridled Ardor on their Sanguinary Guard, and Space Wolves have their strat to heroic intervene 6 inches. If you do some damage in close combat, then all well and good, but they could still be worth it literally for the victory points alone. Overall, I think that there's no getting around that scoring objectives is one of the more skillful aspects of 40k. It's a bit of a tricky question of resource management, and judging just how much you can commit without losing the game as a whole due to taking too much damage. I hope you've enjoyed a few ideas here, though I'm sure there's plenty of other sneaky tricks that you could use to try and pinch objectives. If there's anything that you've used to particularly good effect, I'd really like to hear down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly be keeping the videos coming with new ones every day. Finally, if you have been listening regularly, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. All of these videos do take a fair amount of time to make, so if you are enjoying regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as being able to see certain videos early, regular votes in polls to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry to the channel's prize giveaways, which happen every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.